Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Kennedy Wives, Triumph and Tragedy in America's Most Public Family, by Amber Hunt and David Batcher, narrated by Hilary Huber. Part 1. Rose. 1. From the Cradle. Josie Fitzgerald was afraid her baby might not last the week. The summer of 1890 was brutally hot, and in the week following Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald's birth, 284 Bostonians would die, almost half under the age of 1. But Rose was as hardy a girl as a mother could hope for. She not only survived that first week, she would live until 1995. She would marry a man named Joe Kennedy, who would become one of the richest men in the nation. She would have 9 children between 1915 and 1932, and she'd raise them in homes in Boston, in New York, in Florida, and on Cape Cod. Traveling to Paris for shopping would become routine, just one of the many coping mechanisms she'd use as she learned to look the other way. Her husband cheated on her with hundreds of women. She'd see politically ambitious Joe named ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1938 and live in England on the brink of World War II. She'd pray the rosary and attend Mass with great devotion. She'd return to the United States, the family name in tatters, after her husband's outspoken support of appeasement cost him the ambassadorship and seemingly any hope of a political future. She'd write thank-you notes with scrupulous fidelity. She'd tragically lose 2 children to aviation disasters in the 1940s and see a 3rd child institutionalized for life after a botched lobotomy. She'd hobnob with popes and drink tea with royalty. She'd see her remaining children marry, one by one, and watch as her 3 sons became a mid-20th century political powerhouse. She'd see her Jack elected President of the United States, her Bobby named the country's Attorney General, her boy Teddy elected to the Senate. She'd advise world leaders and play hostess at the White House. She'd attend funerals for 2 sons, killed less than 5 years apart by assassins' bullets, and a funeral for her husband, who died more than 7 years after being immobilized by a stroke. She'd walk 3 miles a day and take bracing ocean swims. She'd stand by Teddy after a car accident off a bridge in Chappaquiddick left a young woman dead and his name splashed across the front of every tabloid in the world. She'd write letters to her adult children about points of grammar. She'd watch one daughter marry a movie star and struggle with alcoholism. She'd watch another, inspired by the experience of having a special needs sister, found the Special Olympics. She'd watch her dozens of grandchildren struggle and achieve in politics, business, media, and philanthropy. She'd watch Teddy reach for the presidential nomination and be relieved when he didn't get it. She would bow her head and accept God's will. She would become a writer, a media personality, a symbol throughout the world of grace and fortitude in the face of tragedy, an example of service to country and humanity. She would see her name become an indelible part of American history. In that stifling bedroom in North Boston, shy, pretty, sweet-natured Josie could not know it, but her daughter would see wonders. 2. Between Joe and Honey Fitz. As teenagers in the first decade of the 20th century, Rose Fitzgerald and Joe Kennedy fell deeply in love. Rose's father responded by sending her to a convent in Holland. The protective father in question was career politician John Francis Honey Fitz Fitzgerald. Born in 1863 in Boston to Irish immigrants, Honey Fitz would come to cover the waterfront of Massachusetts politics. He served on the Boston Common Council, in the state Senate, then for 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, then for 2 non-continuous terms as the mayor of Boston. A short, powerfully built man with intense blue eyes, he was a born politician who loved to work a crowd. He crooned Sweet Adeline at nearly every campaign stop, was loud, brash, unrestrained on the stump, an indefatigable backslapper and handshaker. He married the lovely but much more retiring Josie Hannon in 1889, and Rose, the eldest of their 6 children, was born on July 22nd of the following year. Josie was a deeply devout Catholic, and she inculcated strict adherence to the religion in the children, as would Rose a generation later with her 9 children. If daily Mass and praying the Rosary were habits Rose inherited from her mother, her father transmitted his love of campaigning. Shy Josie mostly abdicated her role as political wife in favor of raising her children. Mother had a limited capacity for the official social swirl, Rose would later write, and from an early age, the energetic, outgoing, articulate Rose served as her proxy. "I've been in the limelight since I was practically 5 years old," she was fond of saying. As a teenager, she was covered by the local newspapers as she joined her father on many public appearances. When not appearing at campaign stops with her flamboyant father, she was attending a series of Catholic schools, where the nuns further instilled in her the importance of personal, daily devotion to the faith. Rose's upbringing was Victorian, an era and ethos that from our vantage seems archaic, restrictive, and conservative. Women actualized themselves, according to Victorian mores, in motherhood. The one progressive impulse in the Victorian era was the new insistence that girls should be well educated. That they be so in order to better raise educated sons was taken for granted. It seems that Rose never seriously questioned any of this. As motherhood is the greatest and most natural God-given gift for women for posterity, she would write in the 1960s, it would seem that the birth and rearing of children in the way which to us seems most ideal would be the most satisfying and the most rewarding career for a woman. In motherhood, she believed, was real power, the power to mold a child. Her words will influence him, not for a day or a month or a year, but for time and eternity, and perhaps for future generations. As a girl, Rose's intellectual verve was undeniable. Graduating from Dorchester High, south of Boston, at only age 15, she set her sights on Wellesley College, an elite, all-women's liberal arts college outside of Boston. Her father vetoed the idea. Even after 2 years of additional convent schooling, he claimed she was too young. Wellesley was also a secular school, and it would not do for an Irish Catholic political figure to send his daughter to a non-Catholic institution. Instead, she took classes at the Sacred Heart Convent in Boston and improved her piano skills at the New England Conservatory of Music. It was around this time that Rose began dating the son of Patrick J. Kennedy, a banker, liquor importer, and a force in Boston's ward politics. PJ, as he was known, was often at ends with, and occasionally a wary ally of, Honey Fitz. Fitzgerald didn't like him, and he didn't like the Kennedy boy either. The boy, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, was a couple of years older than Rose, a tall, athletic, handsome student at Boston Latin, a prestigious boys' high school that was a feeder school to Harvard University. While not a star in the classroom, he excelled in athletics. A year-round athlete, he played football, basketball, and baseball, and captained the tennis team. He was gregarious, charming, and well-liked, already popular with young ladies by the time he started dating Rose. Excluded from many Protestant economic and social institutions, Irish Catholic Boston was, at the time, a tight and interconnected population. The Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds had been vacationing in the same spot, Old Orchard Beach, Maine, a popular resort for Boston's Irish Catholics, since Rose was 8. In 1906, Joe invited her to a high school dance. He was a very good baseball player, Rose later remembered. He didn't drink and he didn't smoke, and then he was a very good, polite Catholic. Rose was sold. Her father emphatically not. He refused to let her go. And so Rose invited Joe to a dance at Dorchester High. What followed was a furtive courtship, enabled by many friends and even Honey Fitz's chauffeur. It took teamwork and conspiracy, because we needed reliable allies, she would remember. During that last year at Dorchester High and the following year, when I was commuting to Sacred Heart, Joe and I managed to see each other rather often. Less often than we would have liked, but more often than my father was aware of. Though she risked incurring her father's wrath, her early relationship with Joe was remarkably innocent, in keeping with the time for a respectable Catholic girl. They attended lectures together, met each other at friends' gatherings, and took walks, which were almost always chaperoned. But in 1908, Honey Fitz, wounded by losing re-election to the mayor's office, separated the couple by sending Rose to the aforementioned Dutch convent. He took Josie, Rose, and her younger sister Agnes to Europe for what Rose presumed was a brief vacation. The family toured Europe for more than 2 months, seeing England, France, Switzerland, and Germany in rapid succession. It's unclear exactly when Honey Fitz told the girls that they'd be left at Blumenthal, a Sacred Heart convent school near Belgium. In her memoirs, Rose would only write, suggestively in the passive voice, that toward the end of that summer it was decided Agnes and I would stay on for a year of school. Despite the abruptness with which they found themselves enrolled, Rose and Agnes adjusted to life at the international school. The atmosphere was Spartan and severe, but the education top flight. Rose sharpened her German and French by conversing with the many native speakers of each among her classmates. She stifled her intense feelings of homesickness and hit the books, all the while keeping Joe's photo on her writing table. Rose was allowed to return to the States in 1909, when her father decided to run again for mayor of Boston. After more than a year away, her passion for Joe was as intense as ever, as was Honey Fitz's disapproval. Not yet realizing the hopelessness of his efforts to snuff out the romance, he again sent her to a convent school, this time in New York City, and then on to Manhattanville College. At Manhattanville, she studied without ever receiving a degree, as the school wouldn't have the state certification to award degrees until years later. It was very different from the Wellesley that she had so ardently hoped to attend. Rose's gender clearly fettered her education, wrote Rose Kennedy biographer Barbara Perry. She possessed an inquiring intellect, a facility for languages, and a prodigious academic work ethic. But her father confined her to stultifying convents and Catholic finishing schools. Although Manhattanville was not Wellesley, Rose nevertheless developed an abiding affection for it, and she found it perfectly suitable years later for her own daughters, Jean and Eunice. Rose also showed her intellectual energy, not to mention her frenetic, find-a-way enthusiasm, in her establishment of the Lenox Avenue Club, later the Ace of Clubs, in 1910. Barred as a Catholic from WASP social clubs like the Junior League, Rose simply started her own, and she insisted on giving it intellectual heft. The meetings usually featured a guest speaker on some political or social issue, and a premium was placed on knowledge of current events, as it would later be at the Kennedy dinner table. Rose was decidedly not a feminist. She would hold, throughout her life, the belief that a woman's most natural fulfillment was found in the raising of children. But she believed fully in the ability of women to engage their minds with, and form educated opinions on, issues facing the larger world. The same year, 1910, as Joe Kennedy was toiling at Harvard, Honey Fitz narrowly recaptured the mayor's office, and Rose prepared for her society debut. Since she was the daughter of the mayor, her debut reception, attended by more than 500 people, was covered by the Boston newspapers. Joe and his parents were in attendance, though Honey Fitz still had not accepted Rose's choice of a beau. When Joe invited Rose to Harvard's junior prom in 1911, Honey Fitz forbade her to accept, despite the fact that she was almost 21 years old, and he employed his usual strategy for keeping the two apart. He got his daughter out of town. He sent her to Palm Beach, Florida. Then he sent her to Europe for 6 weeks. He prevailed upon her to accompany him on visits to Chicago, Indiana, New Jersey, and all over Massachusetts. He took her to Central and South America. He did everything in his power to keep Rose separated from Joe Kennedy. Joe graduated from Harvard in June 1912. And, after a stint as a bank examiner for the state, became, at age 25, the youngest bank president in the United States. He ably took the helm of Columbia Trust, the small East Boston bank his father had founded. In the meantime, he continued to see other women. According to Joe Kennedy biographer David Nassau, at Harvard and after graduation, Joe remained faithful to Rose in the way that men of his generation and class remained faithful to their best girls. He did not court other marriageable women, but neither did he remain chaste awaiting his wedding day. He dated chorus girls and was remembered by contemporaries as a ladies' man. If Rose knew about Joe's proclivities, she most likely wasn't overly bothered. Despite the piety of her upbringing, she was raised in a home where a husband's infidelity was more or less normalized. As a teenager, Rose knew perfectly well what it meant that her father was away so often and why it angered her mother. In 1914, as Fitzgerald commenced yet another re-election campaign, his rival, James Michael Curley, threatened to release details of mayoral corruption and of Honey Fitz's affair with a cigarette girl named Toodles Ryan, who, at 23, was the same age as his daughter. Fitz had no choice but to drop out of the race. It was around this time that Rose decided that she would marry Joe. Honey Fitz be damned. I had read all these books about how your heart should rule your head, she later wrote. I was very romantic, and no two ways about it. On October 7, 1914, the two married in the private chapel of Cardinal William Henry O'Connell. The reception, a relatively small affair with only 75 guests, took place at the Fitzgerald home in Dorchester. Their 3-week honeymoon, bookended by brief stays in New York, included seeing the 1914 World Series in Philadelphia, followed by 10 days of horseback riding, golf, and tennis at the Greenbrier Hotel in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, and a short trip to Atlantic City. At the end of October, they returned to Boston and moved into their new home at 83 Beales Street in the suburb of Brookline. 3. 9 Little Helpless Infants. They did come rather rapidly, she later said, typically dry, and there were a good many of them. Her first 5 children were born within 6 years. When I look back now, I wonder at the size of the job, she'd write much later. And I think that when we stood as a blushing, radiant, gay young bride and groom, we were not able to look ahead and see 9 little helpless infants with our responsibility to turn them into men and women who were mentally, morally, and physically perfect. Perfection is a tall order, but it never would have occurred to Rose to try for anything less. By the time their first child, Joe Jr., was born on July 25, 1915, Rose and Joe had settled into their Beale Street house. It was a nice old wooden frame house with clapboard siding, she'd remember. 7 rooms, plus 2 small ones in the converted attic, only about 25 minutes from the center of the city by trolley, the usual means of transportation in those days. There was a sense of openness in the neighborhood, fine big shade trees lining the sidewalks. Having grown up with a maid and a cook, it was important to Rose to hire help immediately, and they employed a housekeeper who cooked and cleaned and lived in the attic space. As soon as Joe was born, they hired a nurse to care for him. Rose only occasionally breastfed. As a society woman out and about, she didn't want to be home every 3 hours, and the immunological benefits of breast milk were not yet known. The second child, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was born on May 29, 1917, and her first girl, Rosemary, on September 13, 1918. Both would challenge Rose's idea about the perfectibility of her children and her sense of control. Jack was sickly and underweight nearly from the beginning, and at the age of 2.5, he nearly died from scarlet fever. It would be the first of 4 times in his life that he would receive last rites. Rosemary, it would gradually dawn on Rose and Joe, was developmentally disabled, or retarded as it was called then. Efforts to create a normal life for Rosemary, to help her keep pace with her siblings and to make her feel included, would be one of the central focuses and ultimately heartbreaks of Rose's motherhood. As the brood grew, Rose's motherhood took on a managerial quality. With nurses and nannies, Rose employed a team approach. Decades later, when the Beale Street house was opened as a historic site in 1967, she remembered, "I conceived the idea of having a card catalog, which I bought up the street here, and I put their names and the dates of their birth and their weight and the time they had a chic inoculation for diphtheria or scarlet fever, whatever it was, when their tonsils were taken out, whether there were any complications. Anyone could look up and find out that Jack had his tonsils out in New Haven when he was at school there." The data she kept on her note cards was exacting. "I used to weigh them every week," she later said, "and keep track, and then give them more nourishment if they were losing weight, give them an extra glass of milk or cream in their milk." When Joe became ambassador to the United Kingdom in the 1930s, she took the card catalog along with her. "When I got to England, I showed it to some reporters, and they thought it was American efficiency," she said. "But I just said it was Kennedy desperation, because I couldn't possibly keep track of all of them." While Rose toiled as coordinator and troubleshooter at the Kennedy home, Joe's career and fortune evolved. He left the presidency of Columbia Trust in 1917 to become assistant general manager at the Fore River Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation's plant. His position there, overseeing the production of naval vessels, kept him out of uniform in World War I. "Joseph P. Kennedy was not a shipbuilder," wrote Nassau, "but he was young, smart, ambitious, disciplined, and well-connected. He knew how to negotiate a contract, read a balance sheet, and get things done in Boston." It was an enormous project, employing thousands of people and bringing in millions of dollars in government contracts. To cite one example of Kennedy's get-rich ingenuity, one of his responsibilities as assistant manager was to award the contract for the plant cafeteria, which would serve the tens of thousands of plant employees. Kennedy quietly formed a privately held company, the Fore River Lunch Company, and awarded the lucrative contract to himself. The 65-hour work weeks that his ambitions required strained the young marriage. It wasn't so much that Rose needed or expected his help with the children. "I ran the house. I ran the children," she insisted. It seems that she simply missed her husband, resenting his long hours away, both at work and, she almost certainly knew, unwinding with the attentions of other women. In 1920, while pregnant with her fourth child, Kathleen, she even briefly moved back to her parents' Dorchester home. The time away lasted only a few weeks. Honey Fitz, though certainly no fan of Joseph P. Kennedy, was a steadfast believer that a woman's role in marriage was to put up with whatever the husband did. He'd certainly asked his own wife to put up with quite a bit. He convinced Rose to return to Beale Street to resume her responsibilities as wife and mother. She would never acknowledge their break publicly, or, for that matter, that there was ever any friction in the marriage at all. Throughout her life, she would show an amazing ability to present her family as she wanted it seen. She did this with great confidence, even when asserting something that would strike the most casual observer as patently suspect. "You never heard a cross word," she said of her marriage. "We always understood one another and trusted one another, and that's it." After the war, Jo went to work as a stockbroker and manager for the Boston office of Hayden Stone, a Wall Street brokerage firm. It was here that he began playing the stock market in earnest, using his considerable wits and a great deal of inside knowledge to grow his fortune. He also dealt in real estate on the side, buying theaters all across New England, and began his ventures into the film industry, enterprises that would gather force as the 1920s continued. It was around this time that he hired Edward Moore as his assistant. Moore would become his right-hand man, secretary, and confidant. In fact, in 1932, Rose and Jo would name their youngest child after him. His wife, Mary, similarly became Rose's closest friend, and the childless couple became as familiar to the Kennedy children as their own parents. After Kathleen was born on February 20th, 1920, the Beale Street house became cramped. The Kennedys moved to a larger home just a few blocks away in 1921, and Eunice was born there on July 10th. Their household also expanded with the addition of more manpower. In addition to maids, cooks, and nurses for the new babies, Rose hired governesses to assist with the older children. The Moores were also frequent helpers, allowing Rose to travel. She needed the time away, as Jo was rarely around. It developed that the two usually vacationed separately. Jo almost always wanted to golf in Palm Beach in the winter, and Rose had other ideas. "I thought that was a terrible waste of money, to be always coming to the same place," Rose later wrote. "But he used to say that he worked hard during the year, and he wanted to come and rest someplace. He didn't want to be coming to Europe, where he'd have to wait around for customs and changing planes." In 1923, for example, Jo took his 2-week Palm Beach vacation in January. In April, Rose and her sister Agnes took a 2-month trip to California. When she was on her way out the door for this trip, an almost 6-year-old Jack famously cracked, "Gee, you're a great mother to go away and leave your children all alone." It's not clear whether young JFK ever castigated his father for his much more frequent absences. Young Jack was puckish, a lanky instigator. Throughout his youth, he was a source of both frustration and amusement to Rose. He was a very active, very lively little elf, she would remember, full of energy when he wasn't ill, and full of charm and imagination, and surprises, for he thought his own thoughts, did things his own way, and somehow just didn't fit any pattern. Now and then, fairly often in fact, that distressed me, since I thought I knew what was best. But at the same time I was taken aback. I was enchanted and amused. He was a funny little boy, and he said things in such an original way. In looking over my old diary, She wrote to Jack in 1962. I found that you were urged on one occasion when you were...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?